Some stories begin with loss, but this one starts with a homecoming. An old mountain cabin, a daughter facing memories she can't escape, and a wild visitor leaving tracks in the dawn. As grief settles thick as fog, Claire uncovers a secret life woven through the woods, her mother's bond with a wild bobcat named Sparrow. In the silent exchange between woman and animal, a lesson unfolds about letting go, finding trust in the quiet, and loving fiercely without needing to hold on. If you've ever wondered how we carry the ones we've lost, or what it means to let love be wild, this story is for you. Share your thoughts below, and please hit like and subscribe to the channel if you want to support more stories of healing, second chances, and the gentle bonds that change us forever. Let's step quietly into the pines together. The gravel road wound like an old scar through the forest, each turn closing the world behind Claire until all that remained was the whisper of pines and the hush of memory. Her mother's cabin sat hunched at the end of the lane, a weathered silhouette cradled in Appalachian shadows, shingled roof patched by hand and smoke blackened from years of wood fires. Now, after the funeral, there was no smoke, no warmth curling from the chimney, only the flat, oppressive silence of a house that had lost its heart. Claire stepped from her car, pausing to listen. The woods breathed around her, a shifting, secretive music of wind in bare branches and distant crows. The old welcome mat sagged beneath her boots as she reached the porch, her keys trembling in her grip. Every movement felt too loud, as if the house itself might flinch at her return. She hesitated, heart thudding. The door stuck, as it always had, and she had to put her shoulder into it. The familiar creak, she'd cursed it as a teenager, sounded like an accusation now, echoing off the empty walls. Inside, dust motes danced in angled sunlight. Her mother's coat still hung by the door, slumping in the shape of old habits. Claire let her suitcase drop, blinking back tears that burned hot and unwanted. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want the responsibility, sorting through a lifetime of clutter, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to let go. She wanted her mother back. The ache in her chest was raw and pulsing, and the silence seemed to press against her like a living thing. She made herself move, her footsteps muffled on the faded rag rug. The kitchen was just as she remembered. Chipped enamel kettle on the stove, a row of mismatched mugs, a window looking out into a tangle of underbrush. She reached for the stove's old lighter, one of those battered metal jobs that sparked more than flamed. Click, click, click. The gas caught with a whoosh, blue flame flickering in the gloom. Claire pulled open cabinets, hunting for coffee, anything to anchor her in the routine of living. Instead, she found a jar of wild honey, a chipped bowl of hard candies, and her mother's notebook, the one she'd always scribbled lists in, planting dates, chores, small reminders. Close up the chicken coop. Fix the north fence. Each line was written in her mother's looping, confident hand, as if the world could be ordered with enough lists. She ran her finger down the page. Call Claire. That note, written weeks before her mother's last hospital stay, made her throat close up. She slammed the book shut and pressed her forehead to the cool countertop. For a moment, all she could do was breathe. A floorboard creaked behind her. Claire straightened, pulse racing. The house was settling, she told herself, just as it always had. But the feeling wouldn't leave her, a prickling along her spine, the sense of being watched. She glanced toward the window. Only the deepening dusk peered back. The afternoon faded. Shadows pooled in corners, stretching long and strange. She started sorting through her mother's things, drawers crammed with recipes, a shelf stacked with battered field guides, faded photos tucked between the pages. Every object was freighted with memory, a ghost in her hands. She found herself drawn to the old wood stove, still streaked with the black of last winter's fires. As she bent to open the door and sweep out cold ashes, something rustled just beyond the porch, swift, almost silent. Her breath caught. She stilled, listening. The sound didn't come again. Setting aside the ashpan, she went to the window. Outside, the twilight was thick, tinged with a faint fog that crawled along the ground. The yard was empty except for the hunched stump where her mother had once set out scraps for the birds. Claire watched, half expecting to see a fox or a stray dog. Nothing moved. Trying to shake her nerves, she made herself busy, collecting kindling from the porch, lighting the stove, and watching flames leap to life in the iron belly. The warmth made the room a little less empty. She sat, clutching a mug of tea, the silence crowding in again. A mouse scurried in the walls. The refrigerator hummed and clicked. The clock on the mantel ticked, loud as a heartbeat. She told herself she was being foolish, that grief made shadows seem deeper and every sound more sinister. Yet as darkness settled, that uneasy sense grew. She caught herself glancing at the corners, her skin prickling. Was it just the loneliness? Or had the cabin changed in her absence, taken on a new, restless life? She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. Just the mocking, "no service" in the corner of the screen. The landline was disconnected. Her mother had never trusted it anyway, always swearing by the old two-way radio in case of emergency. Claire thought of using it, just to hear another voice, but the idea felt childish. She returned to sorting through boxes, trying to tire herself out. Old letters, yellowed and soft, a wooden carving of a bobcat, whittled by her grandfather, a family totem, fierce and wild-eyed. Her mother had always loved cats, wild and tame alike. The wind rattled the eaves. A loose shutter slapped the side of the house, startling her. She jumped, cursing under her breath. She was too old to be spooked by an empty house, she told herself, but her heart wouldn't slow. Night came, wrapping the cabin in velvet dark. Claire double-checked the locks, drew the curtains, and sat by the stove, watching the fire dwindle. Still, the feeling of being watched remained. A presence, silent and unseen, moving just at the edge of her senses. She thought of her mother's last words, barely a whisper in the sterile hospital room. "Take care of the cabin, Claire. There are things worth keeping." As she drifted into uneasy sleep, a single question haunted her. What did her mother leave behind? Sleep did not come easy in her mother's cabin. The silence pressed in on Claire like a weight, an invisible hand on her chest. She tossed in the narrow bed, half listening to the wind's slow song in the trees and the distant drip of rain from the eaves. Each time she began to drift, a creak or sudden pop would yank her back, heart hammering, mind racing through memories she wished she could put aside. Just past midnight, the house seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Claire lay awake, eyes open in the dark. Her mother's patchwork quilt tucked under her chin. She could hear the old clock ticking on the mantel, louder than any heartbeat. For a moment, she almost believed she'd finally slipped into sleep. But then she heard it. A new sound. Faint, but deliberate. Scratching. The distinct, rhythmic click of claws on the porch boards, as if something was testing its way closer, step by careful step. She sat up, every nerve alive. The sound paused, then came again. Slow, scraping, unmistakably animal. Her imagination leapt to raccoons, or maybe a coyote, but she'd never known either to come so close to the house, not with the lights on. The scratching was followed by a soft thud, like paws landing on wood, and the quietest huff of breath. Claire slid from the bed, moving on bare feet to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain. The porch was cloaked in darkness, broken only by a thin beam of moonlight. She strained her eyes, peering through the glass, searching for a shape, a glint of fur, a pair of glowing eyes. Nothing. Only the cold white light and the restless shadows moving at the edges of her vision. She held her breath, waiting. The night was thick, full of secrets. The scratching started again, moving along the length of the porch, and then, suddenly, silence. Claire listened, hands pressed flat to the windowsill, her heart thudding so loudly she wondered if whatever was out there could hear it too. The minutes crawled. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the roof, and the scratching did not return. But sleep, already a fragile thing, had been banished for good. Claire paced the room, casting nervous glances at the locked door, then finally gave up and made her way to the kitchen. She sat with a mug of cold water, waiting for the first pale light of dawn. When morning came, the woods glistened with dew, the air sharp with the scent of wet leaves and rich, dark earth. Claire pulled on her jacket and stepped outside, every sense alert. The porch boards were cold under her feet, still holding the memory of the night before. She looked down and saw, to her surprise, a line of muddy prints leading from the steps to the far end of the porch. She crouched for a closer look. The tracks were nothing like a dog's, too round, with distinct indentations where claws had pressed into the wood. The prints were wide, padded, with a subtle asymmetry. She remembered her mother showing her once, as a child, how to read the signs left by animals. Raccoon prints like little hands, fox tracks narrow and pointed. But these were unmistakably feline, large and wild. Bobcat. The realization brought a tangle of fear and awe. Bobcats were ghosts in these woods, seen only in glimpses, felt more than found. For one to come so close, lingering on the porch, was something rare. Dangerous, too. Claire felt her skin crawl at the thought. She rose, eyes sweeping the tree line at the edge of the yard, searching for any sign of movement. Only the wind stirred, shivering through the leaves. A flash of memory surfaced. Her mother's voice, low and certain. "Never corner a wild thing, Claire. Let them come to you if they choose." Claire shivered, hugging her arms to her chest, and forced herself to breathe. She circled the porch, following the tracks as they doubled back, looping near the woodpile, and then down the steps toward the yard. The prints were fresh, undisturbed by rain, leading away into the tangle of ferns and undergrowth beyond. Claire's curiosity warred with caution. Part of her wanted to follow, to see where the bobcat had gone, to catch just a glimpse of that wild, solitary beauty. But the smarter part of her mother's voice again, held her in place. She retreated inside, locking the door behind her. The cabin felt smaller now, less like a refuge, more like a thin-walled shelter pressed against the vast wildness outside. As she watched from the window, her mind filled with questions. Why had the bobcat come here? Had it been drawn by the smell of old fires? Or something else? Something deeper, more mysterious? She spent the morning in a kind of uneasy trance, glancing out the windows, listening for the sound of claws on wood. She found herself scanning the shadows beneath the trees, half hoping, half dreading to see movement. To steady her nerves, she returned to her mother's belongings. She rifled through stacks of photographs, her mother with neighbors, laughing at some long-forgotten joke, Claire as a child, muddy and grinning beside the old swing. In one, her mother stood in the garden, a shadowy blur at her feet that could have been a cat, or something else, caught in mid-pounce. The hours passed slowly. As the sun climbed, Claire's fear gave way to a kind of wonder. It was as if the woods themselves were watching her, testing her resolve. The bobcat's presence lingered, not a threat exactly, but a question, hanging in the stillness. Late that afternoon, a neighbor stopped by, a grizzled man named Roy who'd known her mother since childhood. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, peering over Claire's shoulder into the gloom. "You seen any sign of cats out here?" he asked, voice low. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Last night, something was on the porch. This morning there were tracks. Bobcat, I think." Roy grunted, eyes narrowing. "Your mama had a way with wild things. Kept them at a distance, but they always came back around." He shifted, looking uneasy. "Be careful, Claire. Some things don't belong in cages or in houses." She nodded, unsure whether to feel comforted or more afraid. As dusk approached, the forest deepened into blue shadow. Claire watched the edge of the woods, waiting for movement, for the flicker of wild eyes. The question pulsed in her mind, a silent challenge. Why is this creature drawn to her mother's home? And as night crept back over the hills, she found herself no closer to an answer, but more certain than ever that something important, was waiting for her in the darkness. Morning sunlight filtered through threadbare curtains, painting thin stripes across the cabin floor. Claire sat cross-legged amid open boxes and scattered keepsakes, the dust from years of quiet living swirling in the beams. Her sleep had been restless, the sounds of last night echoing in her dreams. A thump, a scrape, the fleeting impression of wildness peering through glass. The discovery of the bobcat tracks still unsettled her, a constant whisper of questions she couldn't shake. She focused on her task, cleaning, sorting, discarding. Each object she picked up seemed to hum with memory. A chipped mug, a faded Christmas card, a necklace made of dried beans strung on twine. But beneath her movements was a growing sense of anticipation, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to notice something that mattered. Mid-morning, as she hauled a box of old linens to her mother's bedroom, Claire's foot caught on a loose board near the bed. The plank gave slightly under her weight, a hollow sound echoing beneath. She paused, heart skipping. She remembered her mother's warning as a child. "Don't hide things under the floor, Claire. You'll just forget them." But the note of mischief in her mother's smile suggested she hadn't always followed her own advice. Claire knelt, pushing aside the bed's faded quilt, and pried at the edge of the board. With a reluctant groan, it popped free, revealing a narrow gap below. Nestled in the dark, just beyond reach, was a small, dust-caked box, a simple thing, wooden and worn, with a tarnished brass latch. Her hands shook as she pulled it free and set it gently on the bed. The box was heavier than it looked. She wiped dust from the lid and hesitated, suddenly overcome by the feeling that she was intruding on something sacred. Yet curiosity, sharp and insistent, overruled her hesitation. She unclasped the latch, the metal stiff with age, and opened the lid. Inside, the contents were few but weighty. The first thing she saw was an old, sepia photograph. It showed her mother, young, hair wild, crouched beside a wire fence, one hand extended toward a bobcat. The animal was not afraid. It gazed at her mother with eyes the color of river stones, ears forward, body relaxed. The intimacy of the moment struck Claire, a trust between human and wild that felt impossibly rare. Beneath the photograph lay a small, weathered diary. The cover was soft with age, corners bent and pages loose. Claire opened it, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The entries were written in her mother's familiar script, looping and sure. March 17th, found her by the creek, thin as shadows, eyes too bright. She's no pet. I'll call her Sparrow, light, wary, never still. I left scraps, watched her eat from a distance. She let me close tonight, just for a moment. Not sure why she trusts me. Claire's heart pounded as she read. Sparrow. The name leapt out. A name for the wild thing that had haunted her dreams. The visitor on the porch. The secret that seemed woven through every corner of this place. The diary continued, entry after entry. Her mother documenting small victories. Sparrow accepting food, letting her mother sit nearby, even brushing her hand against the bobcat's fur. There were warnings, too. Reminders to keep her distance, never to treat Sparrow as tame. She's wild, her mother wrote, and that's how she should stay. At the bottom of the box, nestled in a fold of faded flannel, was a hand-sewn collar. Soft, frayed from years of handling, it was embroidered with tiny wildflowers and stitched in careful block letters, the name, Sparrow. Claire pressed the collar to her cheek, overwhelmed by a strange, powerful mix of emotions. Shock at her mother's secret life, the bond she'd forged with something untamable. Sadness, too, at the loneliness her mother must have felt, sharing so much with a creature who would always live half in shadow. But there was comfort as well, and something like pride. Her mother had loved fiercely and quietly, finding connection not in words, but in actions, a legacy Claire had only begun to understand. She read on, losing herself in her mother's voice. May want, Sparrow's limp is better. She hunts near the old oak now. Saw her watching me through the window tonight. Some part of me thinks she knows I'm here for her, even when I'm silent. August 12th, Claire home from college. Too busy, too sad to notice the woods watching. That's okay. Some things are for keeping to myself. The words stung. Claire had always felt a distance between herself and her mother, an unspoken ache she'd never been able to name. Now, reading these quiet confessions, she saw the threads of love her mother had left for her to find, if only she'd known to look. A sudden noise outside startled her, something moving quickly across the porch. Claire jumped, the diary slipping from her lap, heart racing. She clutched the box to her chest, unsure if she should feel fear or hope. For a wild moment, she imagined her mother's spirit drifting through the trees, still keeping watch. Gathering herself, Claire tucked the box beneath the bed for safekeeping. She smoothed the quilt, running her hand over the fabric, and let the silence settle once more. But the silence felt different now. It was not empty, but full, thick with hidden stories, with secrets passed down like heirlooms, with the presence of a wild heart that lingered just out of sight. For the first time since she'd arrived, Claire felt she understood a piece of her mother's soul, a legacy not of words or possessions, but of trust and quiet care. That night, as the wind picked up and rain began to fall, Claire lay awake, her thoughts racing. She wondered if Sparrow still roamed the woods, drawn by some invisible thread to the place where love had first found her. She promised herself she'd watch for signs. Prints in the mud, the glint of wild eyes at dusk, a soft shape slipping through the underbrush. And as she drifted off to sleep, the box hidden safely beneath her bed, Claire realized she was no longer alone. Something precious had been left for her in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be found. Claire spent the next day drifting through the hours in a haze. The hidden box and her mother's diary had cracked open a new world, a world in which love could be fierce, wordless, and wild. As dusk fell over the ridges and the woods softened into blue shadow, she carried the knowledge with her like a small, secret fire. She could not stop thinking about the bobcat, Sparrow. Her mind replayed the stories, the moments her mother had scribbled in the diary, nights spent waiting, watching from a respectful distance, learning to speak a language built from patience and trust. Now, every sound outside the cabin, every shifting shadow, seemed filled with meaning. The cabin was cocooned in a hush, firelight flickering gold across the walls. Dinner sat half-eaten on the table, forgotten as Claire pressed her nose to the glass, scanning the woods for movement. She left the porch light on, as her mother had always done, an invitation, perhaps, or a promise that someone was waiting. The bowl of leftovers rested on the stump in the yard, just beyond the light's reach. The moon rose, full and heavy, painting silver pathways through the tangled brush. Claire wrapped herself in a blanket and settled onto the porch, listening to the world turn quiet around her. Crickets rasped in the tall grass. An owl called from somewhere deeper in the woods. The chill in the air brought goosebumps to her skin, but she did not move. She waited. She thought about her childhood summers, watching fireflies from this very step. Her mother beside her in companionable silence. She remembered the comfort of knowing someone was always near, even if no words were spoken. Now, the emptiness beside her felt vast and echoing, but beneath it ran a current of hope, sharp and insistent. A twig snapped at the forest's edge. Claire tensed, heart thumping. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a shape, low, sinewy, and unmistakably feline, slipped from the darkness into the moonlight. The bobcat was larger than she'd imagined, with a coat streaked gray at the haunches and muscles rippling beneath. Her ears were tufted, tail bobbed short, her movements a dancer's blend of caution and power. She paused at the boundary between wild and tame, the forest's edge and the cultivated yard, head held high, eyes gleaming gold beneath the moon. Claire barely dared to breathe. The bobcat's presence filled the clearing with an electric charge, alive, ancient, utterly unafraid. For a long moment, the animal simply watched, her body perfectly still, except for the slight twitch of her whiskers. Claire's eyes stung from staring, but she did not look away. She was reminded of her mother's stories, the way Sparrow would come, always at her own pace, never summoned or coerced. The diary entries echoed in her mind. She decides when it's time. My job is just to be here. Now Claire felt the full weight of that lesson. She resisted the urge to call out or move closer, holding herself as quiet as possible, trusting the bond that lingered between their worlds. The bobcat stepped further into the light, paws silent on the soft ground. Her gaze flickered to the bowl on the stump, then back to Claire. The look that passed between them was neither challenge nor fear. It was recognition, something that shimmered just beyond language. For a breathless moment, Claire saw her mother reflected in those wild, amber eyes, a mix of tenderness, intelligence, and a hard-won patience that could not be taught, only lived. The two held each other's gaze in perfect stillness. Claire felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear but from the sense of connection, as if a thread had been knotted between the past and the present, the living and the gone. The bobcat's tail flicked, and her ears twitched forward, curious and alert. Time stretched and folded in on itself. The moon slipped behind a cloud, shadows growing deeper. The bobcat sniffed the air, then padded toward the bowl, movements fluid and unhurried. She ate, never turning her back, always keeping one eye on Claire. When she finished, she licked her paw, then sat regal and relaxed, as if this clearing belonged to her and always had. Claire found herself whispering, voice barely more than a tremor in the air, "Thank you for coming." The bobcat blinked, slow and deliberate, then stood. She regarded Claire for a few heartbeats more, then melted back into the darkness, her form dissolving into the tangle of trees and moonlight. The spell broke. Claire let out a long, shaky breath, heart racing, limbs trembling with adrenaline and awe. She sat on the porch for a long time after, staring at the place where the bobcat had vanished, feeling the ache of absence mingle with a fierce, strange joy. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Claire climbed into bed, unable to sleep, mind whirring with images, the grace of the bobcat, the silent exchange of trust, the way the night seemed changed by their meeting. She touched the collar she had found in the hidden box, running her thumb over the stitched letters. Sparrow. She felt closer to her mother than she had in years, connected by a chain of quiet acts and watchful waiting. In the deep night, as the wind carried the scent of earth and leaves through the cracked window, Claire made a promise to herself and to the wild creature at the edge of her world. She would keep waiting, keep listening, keep the door open for whatever love had yet to find her. The legacy her mother had left was alive, pulsing in the moonlight and the hush between heartbeats, a bond that asked nothing but presence, patience, and respect. And somewhere, out in the woods, a wild heart kept its silent vigil, knowing it was seen and, perhaps, in its own way, loved. The next morning dawned misty and gray. The world outside the cabin hushed beneath a blanket of dew. Claire awoke with a sense of both wonder and uncertainty, her mind still lingering on the image of the bobcat's amber eyes, the silent language they'd shared under the moon. For the first time in weeks, she felt a stirring of hope, yet it was laced with an ache she could not name. Coffee in hand, she settled at the kitchen table with her mother's diary and the hand-sewn collar spread before her. The fire in the stove sputtered as she turned the brittle pages, reading the details of Sparrow's life, how her mother had nursed her, watched her limp heal, learned to respect the boundaries that kept the wild thing wild. The story felt at once intimate and unreachable, as if her mother had left behind a map, but only half the roads were marked. As she traced the stories, a nagging question tugged at Claire. Why had her mother kept this secret? Why hide Sparrow's story from her, from everyone? The answer, she felt, must be here, hidden, perhaps, among the books and keepsakes her mother had treasured. Determined, Claire began another round of searching. She worked methodically, pulling every volume from the old bookshelf in the living room, shaking out dusty field guides and yellowed novels. She sorted through boxes of letters, birthday cards, receipts, each a fragment of the life her mother had built, quietly, deliberately, and often alone. Near noon, as sunlight broke through the clouds, a faded copy of a naturalist's field guide caught her eye, its pages stuffed with notes and newspaper clippings. She opened it and found, nestled between chapters on Appalachian flora, a folded letter. The paper was thin, lined, and covered in her mother's familiar looping script. At the top, the salutation. "To Claire, when you're ready." Claire's hands trembled. She sat by the window, sunlight warming her knees, and unfolded the letter. "Dear Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally come looking for answers. I'm sorry I never told you about Sparrow. I was never very good at explaining the quiet parts of my life, the things I loved that didn't need words. When I found Sparrow, she was near death. Most folks would have left her. I didn't save her to make a pet of her. I wanted her to know that the world could hold kindness, even if she couldn't trust it for long. It wasn't easy. There were days I wondered if I was doing more harm than good, teaching her to accept scraps from a human. But Sparrow always had one paw in the wild. She taught me more about letting go than I ever taught her about holding on. I know you and I have struggled to talk, especially as you grew older. I hope you'll understand. Love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it returns in silence, or in the shape of a wild animal watching you from the trees. If you find this letter, I hope you'll forgive me for the things I left unsaid, and I hope you'll trust the love that lingers in quiet places. With all my heart. Mom." Claire's vision blurred as she finished reading, tears slipping down her cheeks. The letter was a confession and a benediction, a window into the quiet depths of her mother's soul. For years, she'd felt shut out by silence, convinced her mother's love had been hesitant or incomplete. But now she saw the truth. Her mother had loved her, fiercely and fully, just as she'd loved Sparrow, by giving space, by keeping watch, by trusting the bond that grew in the spaces between words. She pressed the letter to her chest, rocking gently as grief and gratitude tangled inside her. The ache she'd carried since her mother's death shifted, softened, becoming something new. A door opening. Later that day, Claire walked the edge of the woods, the letter folded in her pocket, her gaze flicking through the underbrush. She saw the world differently now. Every bird call, every rustle, every shaft of sunlight through the leaves seemed to pulse with the legacy her mother had left behind. As she wandered, she realized the wildness her mother had cherished was not just in Sparrow, but in the land itself, in the way it demanded respect and patience, in the beauty that could not be owned or contained. The lesson was there in the mossy stones, the tangled roots, the shy deer that fled at her approach. Back inside, Claire returned to the diary. She read and reread the passages about Sparrow, marveling at the tenderness that threaded through even the simplest details. There was an entry, dated just a year before her mother's death. "Saw Sparrow at the tree line tonight. She's grown old, but she remembers. I left food, but she didn't come close. Sometimes I think love is just the act of returning, over and over, even when no one calls your name." Claire copied the line into her own notebook, underlining it twice. For the first time, she understood what her mother had meant. Love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it spoke only in the quiet, in the careful watching, in the trust that let someone, or something, choose their own way home. That night, as the sky deepened to blue, Claire sat on the porch again, the unsent letter warm against her heart. The forest was alive with unseen things, but she did not feel alone. She listened to the silence, letting it settle over her, until it became not emptiness, but presence. A hush filled with all the words that had never needed to be spoken. As the stars blinked on, Claire whispered into the darkness, "I understand, Mom. I really do." And far beyond the reach of the porch light, a wild shape moved quietly through the trees, honoring the silent, enduring legacy of love. By the next morning, Claire felt changed, lighter, as if some invisible knot in her chest had finally begun to loosen. She moved through her mother's cabin with more purpose, her steps steadier, her gaze softer as she looked out the window at the wild Appalachian world that had shaped so much of her mother's quiet, complicated love. She woke to a gentle golden light slanting across the kitchen table, highlighting the faded bowl she'd left on the stump the night before. It was empty, licked clean. No tracks were visible from the window, but Claire knew the visitor had returned, silent, respectful, accepting her gift without demanding more. After her morning coffee, Claire slipped on her boots and went outside. She carried a small tin of water and another bowl of food. Nothing fancy, just bits of leftover chicken and rice, as her mother's diary had described. She paused at the edge of the porch, heart thumping, and placed both bowls in the patch of sunlight just beyond the steps. This time, she did not look around or linger. She simply set her offerings down and walked back inside, closing the door behind her without a word. The day unfolded quietly. Claire lost herself in chores, scrubbing the kitchen floor, dusting old shelves, folding linens that still carried her mother's scent. Each time she glanced outside, she caught herself searching for movement at the edge of the woods. But Sparrow did not appear. Claire tried not to feel disappointed. She remembered what the diary had said. Let her come to you if she chooses. Never force her. The truest love is patient. As dusk painted the hills in violet and gold, Claire settled on the porch again, notebook in hand. She had never been much of a writer, but something about this place, and the secrets it had revealed, made her want to record each detail, as her mother had. She wrote about the bobcat's moonlit gaze, about the taste of mountain air at dawn, about the way the silence in the cabin was beginning to feel less like loneliness and more like possibility. The sun slipped behind the ridge and the air grew cool. Claire sat very still, listening to the music of the night. Crickets chirring, a fox barking far off, the wind brushing the porch railings. Then, almost too softly to hear, she caught a rustle in the brush near the old oak. She did not move, barely dared to breathe. Out of the gathering dusk, a shape emerged, low, graceful, wary. The bobcat crept forward, ears flicking, nose testing the air. She paused beside the bowls, whiskers twitching, her gaze flickering to the porch where Claire sat. This time, the distance between them felt smaller. Claire kept perfectly still, her hands loose on her lap, her gaze gentle but direct. Sparrow crouched and drank, her tongue lapping at the tin of water, then turned to the food, eating slowly, savoring each bite. When she finished, she sat in the grass, licking her paws and cleaning her whiskers. For a moment, she looked straight at Claire, not as a threat or a stranger, but as something almost familiar. It was a fragile trust, Claire knew, built with careful patience and an understanding that could not be rushed. She wrote in her notebook, "Sparrow ate at dusk, stayed near the oak, watched me, calm but ready. She is not tame, and that's right. My job is only to witness." Over the next days, this new ritual took root. Each morning, Claire left food and water near the porch, always at a respectful distance, never calling out or trying to coax the bobcat closer. She learned to watch for subtle signs, the shift of grass, the flicker of movement beneath the trees, the soft press of fresh tracks in the mud. Each evening, She waited on the porch with her journal, chronicling Sparrow's visits, her moods, her patterns. Sometimes the bobcat came early, sometimes late. Sometimes she did not come at all. And each day, Claire felt herself changing. The urgency and restlessness that had dogged her since her mother's funeral began to fade, replaced by a steady sense of purpose. She found herself waking earlier, listening more closely, finding beauty in the smallest details, a spider web jeweled with dew, the chorus of frogs at dusk, the gentle hum of bees in her mother's old wildflower beds. She started to understand the kind of love her mother had practiced, a love that respected boundaries, that offered comfort without demanding closeness, that understood the power of letting go. The more Claire observed Sparrow, the more she saw the bobcat as both a living creature and a symbol, a bridge between worlds, a testament to the ways trust must be earned, never claimed. One rainy afternoon, as Claire sat by the window jotting notes in her journal, she noticed Sparrow curled beneath the porch light, a soft, shadowy presence sheltering from the storm. The sight moved her deeply. She realized Sparrow had begun to seek out the light and the safety of the porch, trusting that the human inside would never threaten or betray her. As days blurred into weeks, Claire's entries grew longer and more thoughtful. She wrote about Sparrow's habits, the way she circled before settling, the subtle limp that sometimes returned, the deep, rumbling purr she made when content. She even began to sketch little drawings of Sparrow in the margins of her journal, finding joy in capturing the grace and wildness of her companion. One night, as the wind sang through the trees and rain pattered against the roof, Claire whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for trusting me. I promise to honor it." She did not expect a reply, but somehow the quiet felt full and alive, as if her mother and Sparrow both understood. With each passing day, Claire's grief grew less heavy. She felt her mother's presence not as a sharp ache, but as a gentle strength, alive in every careful gesture, every patient act, every quiet moment of watching and waiting. And in that silent, growing trust between woman and wild, Claire finally found a sense of belonging, not just to the cabin or to her mother's memory, but to the ancient, ongoing story of love that asks nothing but respect, patience, and the courage to let the wild things be. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, each marked by small rituals and the silent companionship of the woods. Claire found herself slipping easily into her mother's old routines. She checked the stove in the morning, swept the porch, left food and water for Sparrow, and then spent the daylight hours cleaning, repairing, and wandering the wild acres that surrounded the cabin. It was a life stripped of noise and hurry, one that demanded her full attention. And in that demand, she discovered a new kind of peace. But peace was not the same as understanding. As she went about these simple tasks, Claire's thoughts circled endlessly around the same question. Why had her mother kept Sparrow a secret? Why, after all these years, had she never mentioned the bobcat, never shared this extraordinary piece of her life? Sometimes, as she walked through the woods with the diary tucked under her arm, Claire would try to remember her childhood more clearly. She'd always known her mother as loving, but not in the ways other mothers were. There were no long, emotional talks, no effusive hugs. Her mother loved in gestures, a hand steadying a ladder, a bowl of soup left by Claire's door on hard days, a silent presence in the audience at every piano recital, eyes shining but mouth closed. She had grown up thinking maybe her mother was simply quiet, reserved, maybe even a little shy. But now, with each entry in the diary and each encounter with Sparrow, Claire began to see the possibility that there was another way to love, one that was neither distant nor cold, but instead so careful and attentive that it respected even the invisible boundaries between souls. Her mother's silence was not an absence, but a discipline, her restraint, an act of faith. One bright afternoon, Claire wandered down to the creek, where her mother had first found Sparrow. The water was low, rushing over smooth stones, sunlight flashing in cold ribbons across the bottom. She sat on a mossy rock, her boots tucked beneath her, and read old stories from the diary, searching for clues. She came limping out of the woods again today. I could tell she remembered the taste of kindness. I sat nearby, reading, not looking at her. Some animals want you to see them, but only if you pretend you don't. The line made Claire laugh, a gentle, sad kind of laugh that broke through her solitude. She looked up from the diary and watched the current dance around a fallen branch, feeling her mother's words settle around her like a blanket. She thought about all the ways she'd tried to force love into shapes that made sense to her, all the arguments and tears that had passed between her and her mother, each one leaving a scar she'd carried for years. What if, she wondered, love was supposed to be quiet sometimes? What if it was enough simply to show up, to wait, to listen? She stood, following the creek upstream, her boots squelching through mud and moss. The air was rich with the scent of pine and earth, birds calling overhead. In the hush, she replayed memories. The time her mother found a wounded bird and spent days coaxing it back to health, never expecting gratitude. The way her mother could sit for hours in the garden, watching clouds drift by without a word. Back at the cabin, Claire pulled out her mother's box of old stories and letters. Some she recognized from years past, notes she'd once dismissed as boring or routine. Now she read them with new eyes. There were recipes, lists, sketches of plants, and notes on the weather. But always, beneath the surface, ran a current of care. Every detail, every observation, was another way her mother had shown she was paying attention. That evening, as the light faded and the woods turned silver and blue, Claire sat on the porch with her journal, reflecting. She wrote about the ache she felt, how it was changing, softening into gratitude. She wrote about the bobcat's visits and the way Sparrow had begun to linger by the porch, stretching in the last rays of sun, sometimes even curling up by the old oak as if it were her own. There was an intimacy in these encounters, but also a boundary. Sparrow was never truly tame. She came and went as she pleased, sometimes vanishing for a day or two before reappearing at the edge of the woods. Claire found herself learning patience, learning not to expect or demand, only to be present. Sometimes she caught herself talking aloud, not to the bobcat, but to her mother. She would sit in the rocking chair, sipping tea, and share her day in a low, steady voice. "I fixed the porch rail today, Mom. Saw a hawk circling the meadow. Sparrow came by. She's looking strong." It didn't matter that no one answered. The act of speaking was enough, as if by filling the silence with her own words, she was finally meeting her mother in the middle. With each passing day, Claire felt her understanding of love deepen. She no longer saw her mother's quiet as a failing, but as a choice, a way of honoring the wildness in others, whether human or animal, by giving them space to grow, to come and go, to be themselves. Her grief, while still present, had begun to take on a new shape, a gratitude for all the small, silent lessons her mother had given her. Love, she realized, was not always a blaze of passion or a flood of words. Sometimes it was simply the steady warmth of being there, again and again, even when it was hard. One night, as stars glittered through the trees and the bobcat curled beneath the porch, Claire whispered into the dark, "I see you now, Mom. I finally see you." And in that moment, with the woods holding its breath and Sparrow purring softly under the porch light, Claire understood that she was exactly where she was meant to be, living the lesson her mother had spent a lifetime teaching. That love, at its truest, is patient, watchful, and always, always willing to let go. The days had grown warmer and heavier, the mountain air thick with the scent of rain and wildflowers. It was the kind of weather Claire remembered from childhood summers, when storms would come in fast over the ridge, thunder rolling like drums, the world going still before the downpour. The woods seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if even the birds and squirrels were bracing for something wild and inevitable. Claire had fallen into her new life so completely that the outside world barely seemed real. Her phone was silent, messages from friends and co-workers left unanswered. She found herself speaking less and listening more, attuned to the rhythms of wind and birdsong, the subtle language of the land and its creatures. She continued her rituals with Sparrow, setting out food and water, journaling each encounter, watching the bobcat's wild grace with a mix of awe and affection. One afternoon, as she stood on the porch watching dark clouds gather over the mountains, she felt a ripple of unease. The air was restless. A hot wind tugged at her hair, bending the tall grasses and setting the old wind chimes jangling in anxious bursts. The light had a strange, yellow cast, as if the sun itself was holding its breath. Claire glanced toward the tree line. Sparrow had not appeared for 2 days, longer than she'd ever gone without a visit. Usually she'd spot the bobcat's shape at dusk, slinking through the underbrush, or find prints in the soft earth beneath the old oak. Now the yard was empty, shadows gathering beneath the trees, and the silence was heavy with worry. As the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, Claire's heart pounded with dread. She hurried inside, pacing the kitchen, glancing anxiously at the window. The storm came quickly, rattling the cabin with sheets of rain and flashes of lightning that split the sky wide open. Thunder crashed so close it shook the walls, and the power flickered, then died, plunging the room into an uneasy gloom. For hours, the storm raged. Claire lit candles, curled up by the wood stove, and tried to lose herself in the diary, but she could barely read the words for the fear pressing in on her. She thought of Sparrow, somewhere out in the chaos, alone, vulnerable, the wildness that made her strong, now a liability against the storm's violence. Images raced through her mind. The bobcat huddled beneath a tree, injured or frightened, calling for help that would never come. When the worst of the storm finally passed, the world outside had been transformed. Branches littered the yard, puddles glimmered in the moonlight, and the woods looked washed clean, the air sharp and cold. Claire barely waited for dawn before pulling on her boots and a raincoat, grabbing a flashlight, and heading into the trees. She followed the path her mother had worn through the underbrush, calling Sparrow's name in a low, steady voice. Her heart hammered with every step, scanning for tracks or any sign of the bobcat. The ground was slick, leaves plastered to the mud, making each step treacherous. She searched for hours, growing colder and more desperate with each passing minute. Finally, as the sun began to rise, she heard it. A faint, pitiful sound, almost lost beneath the drip of water from the leaves. Claire pushed through a thicket of brambles, ignoring the sting as thorns caught her arms. There, beneath the shelter of an ancient oak, she found Sparrow. The bobcat was hunched low, her fur matted and soaked, eyes glazed with exhaustion and pain. One leg was twisted beneath her body, and her breathing came in shallow pants. Claire dropped to her knees, the cold and the mud forgotten. She reached out slowly, remembering her mother's instructions from the diary. Move slow. Let her know you're there. No sudden movements. She spoke softly, her voice trembling. It's okay, girl. I'm here. Sparrow watched her, eyes wide and wild, but she did not run. Instead, she let out a long, low growl, less a threat than a warning, a reminder that she was still, even now, a creature of the wild. Claire slid her raincoat from her shoulders and draped it over Sparrow, shielding her from the worst of the morning chill. She stayed beside her, whispering reassurances and humming snatches of old lullabies her mother used to sing. The bobcat's breathing slowed, her body relaxing by degrees as Claire sat vigil, keeping watch over the fragile line between life and death. Hours passed. The sky lightened, birds began to sing, and the world seemed to exhale. Claire stayed, shivering, hunger gnawing at her, but unwilling to leave Sparrow's side. She remembered another line from her mother's diary. Sometimes love means showing up, even when there's nothing you can do but wait. As Sparrow drifted in and out of consciousness, Claire's mind raced with memories. Her mother nursing a wounded bird, patching a broken fence, sitting up all night when Claire was sick as a child. She realized with a painful clarity that the lesson was not about saving, but about being present, about surrendering the need to fix and simply offering comfort when and where you could. By midday, Sparrow's breathing grew steadier. Claire offered her water from a cupped hand, watched as the bobcat drank weakly, her tongue rasping against Claire's skin. For a brief, shining moment, all the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. Human and animal, past and present, pain and love, all tangled together beneath the ancient oak. As the sun reached its peak, Sparrow struggled to her feet, shaking off the raincoat and blinking into the light. She took a few shaky steps, then paused, looking back at Claire with eyes that were both wild and wise. In that gaze, Claire saw her mother, saw the strength, the courage, the fierce, wordless love that had carried both women through loss and darkness. She understood, finally, what her mother had meant. Real love was not about possession or control. It was about presence, about standing with someone, creature or human, when they needed you most, and letting go when the time was right. Claire watched as Sparrow limped into the woods, her form soon swallowed by sunlight and shadow. She remained kneeling beneath the oak, tears mingling with the dirt on her cheeks, her heart full with the bittersweet grace of surrender. In the quiet that followed, Claire realized that she had found the answer she'd been seeking, not in words or deeds, but in the simple act of staying. Love, at its purest, was silent and steadfast. It was not about holding on, but about trusting enough to let go. And as the breeze carried away the last echoes of the storm, Claire felt her mother's presence all around her, gentle, watchful, and finally, at peace. The world had been washed clean by the storm. When Claire opened her eyes the next morning, the air was crisp and sharp, alive with the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. Sunlight spilled across the worn wooden floor, tracing patterns like gold thread. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the deep hush that followed the storm's violence, a silence that felt less empty now and more like a gentle embrace. Her limbs ached from hours spent kneeling in the mud beneath the old oak. The memory was vivid. Sparrow, cold and shivering, pressing close not out of submission but necessity, and Claire's own trembling hands offering warmth. There had been fear, yes, but also a strange kind of peace, a surrender to something greater than herself. She understood in those hours the true shape of love. Claire pushed herself up and dressed quickly. The world outside was dazzling, bright with possibility. Every leaf was rimmed with water. Every bird's song sounded clearer. And the cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, as if some old tension had finally broken and run off with the rain. She made her way out to the yard, heart thudding as she scanned the woods for any sign of movement. At first, all was still. Then she heard it, the faintest shuffle in the underbrush, followed by a low, hoarse mew. Sparrow. The bobcat limped from the shadows, her fur still matted but her gaze sharp and aware. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, the boundary between wild and home. Claire crouched low, speaking softly, coaxing with open hands and gentle words. "You're safe. Come on, girl. Let's get you warm." Sparrow moved with careful, deliberate steps, closing the gap between them with dignity intact. It was a meeting of equals, one offering help, the other accepting, just for now. Claire bundled Sparrow in a blanket and lifted her, surprised by the animal's lightness. The bobcat didn't resist, but rested in Claire's arms, shivering, her heart thudding a wild rhythm against Claire's chest. Inside, the cabin was warm, the wood stove glowing with steady heat. Claire set Sparrow down by the hearth, placing bowls of water and broth within reach. She tended the bobcat's wounds as best she could, recalling her mother's gentle touch and the field notes she'd read in the diary. Patience above all. Move slow. Speak soft. Let them know you are with them, not over them. For 3 days, Claire nursed Sparrow. The bobcat grew stronger, her eyes regaining their sharp, wary gleam. Sometimes she would nap in the glow of the fire, twitching her tail in her sleep. Other times she sat alert, watching the windows, yearning for the wild world just beyond the glass. Claire watched her, journal in hand, recording each small victory. Sparrow drank water, ate chicken, stretched in the sun, and each setback too, learning that healing was a process of steps forward and slips back. During those days, Claire came to understand that caring for Sparrow was as much about letting go as holding on. She couldn't control the bobcat's fate. She could only offer what was needed when it was needed, and trust Sparrow to know when it was time to return to the world she belonged to. At night, Claire would sit by the fire, reading her mother's words. Real love is an invisible thread. It doesn't tether, it connects. It doesn't bind, it sets free. Sometimes, she'd find herself speaking aloud to her mother, telling her about the day, about Sparrow's progress, about the peace and sorrow that filled the little house in equal measure. On the 3rd morning, Claire awoke to find Sparrow sitting upright, ears forward, eyes bright. The bobcat looked at her, then at the door, and Claire understood. She opened it wide. Sunlight poured in, and Sparrow stood, stretching, every muscle trembling with anticipation. Claire knelt beside her, stroking the bobcat's flank one last time. "You know where you belong," she whispered. "You always did." The words felt right. Neither a command nor a plea, just a recognition of the wildness that had shaped them both. With a final lingering glance, Sparrow limped through the doorway and into the morning. Claire followed her outside, watching as the bobcat paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back with that same steady, knowing gaze. Then, with a flick of her tail, She vanished into the trees, swallowed by sunlight and shadow. Claire stood for a long moment in the yard, feeling both empty and full. The loss was sharp, but so was the gratitude. She knew now that Sparrow's presence was never meant to be permanent. Her mother had understood that. The true legacy, the thing that endured, was not Sparrow herself, but the bond they'd shared. A connection forged from patience, respect, and an unwavering willingness to let go. As she cleaned up the cabin and tended to the little wounds left behind by the storm, broken branches, damp rugs, a few books scattered by the wind, Claire felt a quiet transformation taking root inside her. Grief was still there, but softer, no longer the dark weight that had threatened to swallow her. In its place grew something brighter, a sense of purpose, a belief that every small act of kindness, every moment of presence was part of a larger story. That afternoon, Claire sat on the porch, journal open, writing a letter she knew she might never send. "Mom, you taught me what love looks like. Not just in words, but in all the things you did, day after day, with no expectation of reward or recognition. You showed me how to care for the wild things, how to hold them gently, and, when the time came, how to let them go. I see you now, in every green leaf, every sunbeam, every wild heart that moves through these woods. Thank you for everything." As dusk settled over the mountains, Claire felt the invisible thread that bound her to her mother, to Sparrow, and to the land itself. Strong, unbroken, alive. She knew the story was not ending, only changing shape. Every act of kindness carried forward, every quiet lesson woven into the world, making it gentler, wilder, and more true. And when the night finally fell, with the cabin wrapped in peace and the woods alive with possibility, Claire understood the most profound lesson of all. Love, at its best, is a living thing, set free, never gone, always finding its way home. Summer lingered long in the mountains, casting the woods in honeyed light. The days grew slower, and the sharp edge of Claire's grief dulled into something soft and resonant. A music that hummed quietly through the pines, the fields, and the empty cabin rooms. It had been weeks since Sparrow disappeared into the wild. The old fear of loneliness no longer clung to Claire. Instead, she found herself filled with a sense of presence so profound it colored every ordinary moment. She decided to stay. Not out of obligation or regret, but because the cabin and its wild acres had become a kind of homecoming, a space where memory and hope could live together. She found herself savoring the details of each day, the creak of the porch boards at dawn, the scent of coffee rising as she stoked the morning fire, the sun-warmed dust swirling in the light. She mended what needed mending, painted the faded shutters, planted wildflowers at the edge of the yard, each task a quiet tribute to the woman who'd taught her the value of tending to small, important things. As summer gave way to autumn, Claire invited friends and neighbors over for coffee, sharing laughter in the kitchen and stories on the porch. When they asked about her time alone in the cabin, she spoke not of sorrow, but of transformation. "I thought I came here to say goodbye," she told them, "but what I really found was a way back to myself." Yet the story that lived closest to her heart, the story of Sparrow, remained something she held carefully, like a living flame. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and dusk pressed at the windows, she would reach for her mother's old diary and reread the passages, feeling the closeness of two lives bound together by more than blood. The wild heart of a bobcat, the gentle patience of a mother. These were the gifts she had been given, the legacies she carried forward. One golden afternoon, As the leaves turned amber and the world prepared for winter, Claire sat at her writing desk and gathered her memories onto the page. She wrote not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever lost something precious, anyone who had waited for a sign in the darkness or found comfort in the silent companionship of an animal. She wrote to keep the story alive, to honor the invisible threads that tie us all to the ones we love. For me, this is not just a story about a bobcat, she wrote, or a cabin in the woods, or even the bond between mother and daughter. It's proof that unconditional love and gentle kindness are the legacies that never fade. We carry them with us, sometimes not even knowing, until the world brings them softly to our door. Some nights, she would step outside as the moon rose, letting the cool air brush her skin, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of night creatures. She always left a bowl of water and a scrap of food by the old stump, a silent invitation to whatever wild things might be wandering near. And though she never again saw Sparrow up close, there were times when she glimpsed a sleek, shadowy form slipping through the trees, or found fresh tracks by the porch after rain. A reminder that some connections endure, even when we cannot see them. There were moments, too, when Claire felt her mother's presence as surely as if she were sitting beside her on the porch. She could almost hear her voice, low and warm. "Take care of what's been entrusted to you, Claire. Let love be wild. Let it come and go as it needs to." The lessons were simple but enduring, acts of patience, of kindness, of trust in the unseen. Sometimes the loneliness would return, sudden and sharp, especially on quiet evenings when the wind rattled the windows and the fire burned low. But even then, Claire did not feel lost. She understood now that grief was simply another form of love, proof that something beautiful had taken root in her life. She allowed herself to remember, to miss, to hope, all at once. The longer she stayed, the more Claire realized that the legacy left to her wasn't just the cabin or the old stories or even the memory of Sparrow. It was something larger, something she could share. So she began leaving her own notes tucked into field guides, writing words of comfort for whoever might find them. If you're reading this, you are not alone. Someone came before you. Someone cared. Someone left a light on in the dark. On a crisp evening, as twilight gathered, Claire wrote a final letter, this time to anyone who needed it, anyone grieving, anyone searching for meaning, anyone listening for the quiet echo of love returning. If you've ever felt the presence of someone you've lost, or found comfort in the wild heart of an animal, share your story below or with someone close to you. Let's keep these memories alive, together. Sometimes the greatest love is the one that knows how to let go, but always finds its way back home. She closed her journal, stood, and opened the door to the night. The woods were alive with whispers and memories, the air carrying the promise of new beginnings. Claire breathed it all in, grief and gratitude, absence and presence, the unbroken line of kindness that ran through everything her mother had ever touched. She stepped out onto the porch, feeling the solid wood beneath her feet, the pulse of the living world around her. The story wasn't over. It was woven into the land, the light, the hush that followed her everywhere she went. It would live on as long as she remembered, as long as she listened, as long as she loved. And in that gentle darkness, with her heart open and her hands steady, Claire knew she had become both the keeper and the giver of her mother's greatest gift, a legacy of wild, patient love, quietly shaping the world for those still to come.